Thank you. So I will stop my share. And if you have questions, feel free to toss them in the chat and I will take a look at all of those. Good timing. All right. So let me take a look here. I guess I should have a sip of water. Oh, nice. Okay. Part of my garden is now shaded by a tree. Can I plant lettuce in the shady spot? From Nina. Yeah, absolutely. As I was mentioning, the one caveat to that is to maybe check out what's going on in your soil where you removed the tree. And that again is something you can get from the extension office, get a little soil test. And you might need to amend that area before you plant in it, but absolutely nice and shady, love it. Grow some lettuce there. Heat tolerant lettuce seed. Salanovas are great for that. Yeah, they can be a little bit pricey as seed, but they come up really perfectly. And one of like my favorite things about them is you cut them right at the bottom and like their thing is they just fall in exactly perfect salad sized leaves. So they're beautiful and they're more heat tolerant. Salanova. My cucumbers have yellowing leaves this year. Any suggestions? So yeah, what I was mentioning earlier with sowing cucumbers and, oh, I guess I mentioned squash, but cucumbers, same deal. Sow them a little bit later. So it could be these weird temperature swings we've just seen over the past week, right? We went some like intense heat to now like cold and rainy, and now it's 60 and 80, you know, it's a little all over the place. And sometimes the first true leaves that pop out of cucumbers, that's just what they look like. And then once they start growing, they'll be happier and healthier. So two recommendations, I guess. One, you could seed right now again and get them going, and they're good to go now from seed. They'll pop up in a day or two. Or you can just let it be and do a foliar feed. Once you see more than those two like little round leaves at the bottom and you start seeing the kind of like hairy, coarse, like mapley shaped leaves coming out at the top, you can do that foliar feed with some fish emulsion, give it some food, and it will bounce right back. Okay, we have at least 20 strawberry plants and we're harvesting 1 to 2 strawberries a day. How do we get them to grow and all at the same time so we can enjoy a bunch instead of at one day? We also have a blueberry that never bared any fruit. Sure. So strawberries, there's several different types of strawberries. There are ever-bearing strawberries, which might be what you have. And then there are what's called June-bearing strawberries. So those are the kinds you might want if you want them all at once. So I would seek out the June-bearing varieties, or you could, again, with the succession planting, that's another thing you could do with strawberry varieties. So there's another type of strawberry called Alpine Strawberries. They're much smaller, but they're also extremely sweet. They look like they're right out of a folk story. They're so cute. And they grow for a pretty long period of time. So you could stagger Alpine, June-bearing, and ever-bearing and plant all three of those. And that's where you would probably get the most bang for your buck. Blueberries never bore any fruit. So I don't know when you put those in, but in the past few years, we've had some really dry conditions, specifically last year. And a lot of fruit-bearing things were just totally miserable and just couldn't get enough water no matter how hard we all tried. So don't give up, and also try to stagger your varieties of blueberries because cross-pollination happens. Sometimes that really helps. Usually that's kind of a general good rule of thumb for any fruit-bearing tree. And hopefully I'm not going too fast. I just want to breeze through everybody's questions here. Touch on mulching. So around perennials, if so, any particular kind, or is organic compost just as good? Any pros and cons for both? Great question, Pam. So I definitely am a mulching advocate, but I'm also a composting advocate. So I would say the best general rule of thumb there, you got your perennial planted, around the base of the perennial, sprinkle in a good amount of compost and fertilizer, kind of scratch it into the surface of the soil. water really deeply, and then mulch. And what that's going to do, and I would say a bark mulch there, and an undyed bark mulch is just fine. And that's essentially the bark mulch in that case is going to kind of help insulate. It's, you know, also more ornamental, more attractive. But in general, I guess I would say both, and just doing it in that order: compost first, mulch second. And spring rolls around, you want to give it another bit of feed and compost, just pull that mulch away, same process over and over. Where do you buy good straw mulch? So I always tell everyone I used to manage the vegetable department at NatureWorks, so I'm a little bit biased, but NatureWorks is in Northford. I sing their praises all the time because there's a very educated staff there, and I genuinely stand behind all of the products that they provide, and they put a lot of time into researching what they sell people. So they have a great straw mulch. I think it's called Mainly Mulch, is the one they have right now. Oh, so someone wrote that right below. Perfect. Look at that. Thoughts on gravel in lieu of mulch for water retention and soil. So it says that's from iPad, but maybe if you just want to clarify there, are you referring to gravel in your walking areas or around the base of your plants? If you could just let me know that, and I'll move on to the next one. Can I continue to grow flowers like petunias inside during the winter if I have heating pads and grow lights? From Kane. So some things are more tolerant of this than others. And again, that would probably be a talk in itself. Petunias in particular are probably not going to like it, to be honest. You could do it. So like I had some mandevilla vines, for example, in my front planters, and I was like, I know these can be house plants, so I'm gonna bring them in. And I did, and in that case, if you want to experiment, what you would do is at the end of the season, cut them back pretty hard, give them that deep watering, maybe some organic plant magic, but not quite fertilizer, because you don't want them really trying to like flower in the house. You're more likely just holding them over. But what happens is they're just kind of confused. Like they're ready to either go completely dormant, and in our case, they, you know, die because they're an annual plant. So they sort of just like have a lifespan where it's like we can play God a little bit and like stretch that out. But in general, you'll find that they just don't stay as happy when we do that. But that's not the case for everything. So that's why I say it's kind of a longer discussion. So for example, like scented geraniums, that's something, you know, that like mosquito plant that a lot of people get, citronella, that you can technically cut back and bring in as a house plant. You know, your fig trees, you can cut back and bring them inside and keep them in the warmth and then bring them out in the spring. You know, so there's a lot of different answers, but petunias in particular, I think would just be like, no, I gotta die now. Great. So are there any vegetables that are good to grow in July and August from seeds that are perennial? I would say the first thing that comes to mind for me is sorrel. You can type that in the chat. So there's red vein sorrel and just plain green sorrel, and it's a delicious green that you can cut and cut and cut, and it just comes back, and it's really ornamental, but it's also edible. Also just a lot of fruit bearing stuff. So like pawpaws and blueberries and things like that. You can, you know, always plant later in the season, but they won't necessarily fruit later in the season. I'll have to think more about that. Perennial edibles are a whole beast in themselves. And it's also kind of like experimenting with some unconventional food. So I wouldn't say that there's a ton that you can plant directly in the ground. That's sort of the standard stuff, other than that list I showed you before of what you could grow from seed and stagger and grow later. But perennial is the tricky part of that riddle. But sorrel is like a green that immediately comes to mind. And I can try to keep thinking about that. How do I prevent tomato blight? I used a foliage spray of 1 aspirin and a liter of water last year. It worked until I got off the schedule. Yeah, so blight is one of those things that is just an uphill battle. And again, that's something that, like, if people are experiencing it locally, it's likely that everybody's kind of got it, and there's not a ton you can do except, again, seeking out late and early blight resistant varieties to begin with. And yes, doing what you did by focusing on the immunity of the plant early on. So if you're in an area where you've experienced blight several times before, you could try to plant in a slightly different area, making sure that you're also specifically planting in maybe a different set of soil and potentially clearing out some of the soil that you've had. And when you first plant it, really getting into that the fish emulsion and Stress X, and really kind of like babying it in the beginning phase. But yeah, specifically seeking out those blight resistant varieties, which are out there. I don't know any off the top of my head. I wish I could say them, but they are out there, and I would pursue that method. Why are my mint leaves turning pale green? It could be that if it's at the bottom of the plant, could be that they're literally just being shaded out and they're not getting enough sunlight. And mint is one of those that is so happy when you're giving it a haircut like every few days, really cutting it back hard, and it will just always keep growing more and more for you. So try that. Try a really healthy harvest and making sure that the bottom leaves are getting enough sunlight. Gravel at the base of a plant in a pot. Okay, thank you for clarifying. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend gravel. It's for a few things. One is that weeds will still get in, and it's really hard to weed out around rocks. I've found is one thing. But it also just doesn't do a ton in terms of moisture retention, because it can kind of heat up very easily. Like the rocks can get kind of warm, and it doesn't insulate the soil as much as you would think. I would say that gravel is a more decorative element than it is a like health of the plant element, to be honest. And it doesn't really break down. So what I've found in gravel areas in the past is that, like, you put it around the base of the plant, you have weeds coming up, you're trying to like get on top of it, and you just end up like raking the gravel away, and it kind of never goes away. So I feel like it's just one of those decisions that if you make it, you're kind of like committed. So just be mindful of that if you use it, it's just something that might, ultimately drive you crazy. So hope that helps. Sorry. Is there a way to know what kind of plants like to be cut back hard regularly, / regularly, other than looking up each plant? I like this thought exercise here. So I guess one way to view this is like most herbs, like, parsley, rosemary, mint, thyme, cilantro, any herb really, sage, oregano, any of those love being harvested as much as possible. So that's a good starting off point. And another thing is not necessarily vegetables. This isn't always the case. Actually, I would say more often it's not the case, but for like perennials and annuals, after something has flowered, it's a general rule of thumb that that's when you can prune. And certain things like, trying to figure out a general way to say this across several plants, but you can deadhead, like just physically remove the top of the spent flower. But some plants you can also like harvest down. So my first thought goes to daisies. Daisies are something that, they'll get really tall, and how they kind of fall over. Maybe that's the general rule, is if you see a plant that has a tendency to kind of flop, that in general you can prune it early in the spring, and it will typically come up with nice like short and stout growth rather than like tall and skinny. And if you cut something after flowering, that will sort of be its method of growth the following year, is short and stout and nice and full. So hopefully that kind of gives you a nice rule of thumb. Most herbs and most things right after flowering is a great time to cut. How often should a vegetable garden be watered? I would say in general, I end up watering daily a lot. And this is something I didn't mention in my presentation, but highly recommend everyone checking out and just like experimenting with, which this will be easier for those of you who have raised beds or growing directly in the ground, is to experiment with irrigation. I'm a total irrigation nerd, and I love setting up irrigation because it's actually kind of fun. And there's a great website out there called Dripworks. Let me put that in the chat. And they're one of the best websites I've ever found in terms of figuring out a setup for yourself. And in that case, what you can do is turn your irrigation on for an hour. And there typically it's like a tiny slit in the drip line, and it just slowly releases a little bit of water, again, right at the base of the plant. And it's on there for an hour, and that's typically enough for the day, because again, it's a slower release. Whereas if you're going out there and physically watering, I'm really trying to sit on certain things with my hose for a good minute. And I'm doing that for every plant I have, which you can imagine is a lot. And so it sometimes takes me over an hour to do. So in general, though, I would say every day. And with the weather we've been having lately, which before this nice rain we've gotten, that was the struggle, is keeping up with watering. So again, certain things are more water sensitive than others, but your plants will usually tell you if things are looking droopy and sad. Go for a nice early morning watering and do it for longer than you think you need to. And that early morning, what that's going to do is give the plants a little bit of like relaxing time to take in their water. Whereas if you do it in the middle of the hottest part of the day, they're like, oh, give me water, I'm dying over here. So kind of making your water last for as long as possible, if that makes sense, kind of making your watering count. Yeah, so Nina, I'm confused about mulch. I read that hardwood mulch takes nitrogen out of the soil. I wanted to use the bark mulch in my vegetable garden. Yeah, so bark mulch, again, it's kind of like the rock thing around your vegetables. It heats things up. It doesn't break down as fast. So it's just kind of this like chunky thing at the end of the season that's just sitting on the surface of the soil. It gets very warm. Whereas bark mulch allows a little bit of breathing room. It's very lightweight, and just kind of holds in it's more of like a mat. Whereas the bark mulch is more of like a heavy carpet, I guess. I don't know the best way to compare them other than to say that the straw mulch is much more lightweight, breaks down much more readily. I know bark mulch looks nice, but that's a better option for like walkways or perennial gardens that can kind of keep that mulch on them for a long time. Whereas the veggie garden, you're kind of turning it over year after year. Yeah, watering in the evening is also a great approach. So early morning or late at night. The only thing you want to be careful of is early in the season, if you're seeing some cool temperatures in the evening, you don't want to put your plants to bed with wet hair, I guess. So just making sure that when you water, you're mindful again to water at the base. But that's a safe bet too. I'll sometimes do it when I get home from work or after dinner or something like that, similar approach. And that actually the same goes for if you're applying any fungicides or pesticides, even organic ones, you want to do the same method, early in the morning or late at night. So better to water in the morning than the evening. Yeah, either or. I would say in general, the morning kind of like powers them through the day. But if it's been a really stressful, hot day, an evening water is sometimes a good way to get them acclimated for the next day. But in general, I would say, I guess if I had to choose, I would definitely choose the morning because gives them a nice healthy drink, and then they have that for the whole day to sustain them rather than having it at night and making that last the whole day until the next night.